The Varlon 7 artificial satellite rotated in perfect synchronicity with its gas giant namesake, casting long shadows through the reinforced transparisteel corridors of the Interstellar Military Academy. Lieutenant Cadet Naomi Vance pressed her palm against the cool observation panel, watching the swirling storms that could swallow entire Earth continents dance across the planet's surface below. Her reflection stared back at her through the glass, a lone human face among a sea of alien uniforms that filled the hallway behind her. First human in advanced tactical training, she muttered to herself, adjusting the collar of her cobalt blue cadet uniform. No pressure. The year 14,827 of the intergalactic calendar had brought humanity exactly 27 years of membership in the cosmic community, barely a heartbeat in galactic terms. To most species here, humans were still the awkward newcomers who'd somehow stumbled into faster-than-light travel and demanded a seat at the table. The fact that Naomi had tested into the elite program was seen by many as either a clerical error or a diplomatic gesture gone too far. The chrono display on her wrist chirped softly. 3 minutes until advanced combat tactics with Lieutenant Colonel Gorvek. Naomi straightened her spine and turned toward the training facility, ignoring the sidelong glances from a cluster of Zentorian cadets whose crystalline exoskeletons clinked softly as they moved aside to let her pass. The training hall stretched 3 stories high, its walls lined with holographic battle projections from 1,000 different conflicts across the galaxy. Tiered seating surrounded a central combat platform that could simulate everything from zero-gravity environments to methane atmosphere conditions. As Naomi entered, conversations in 24 languages gradually fell silent. Lieutenant Colonel Gorvek stood at the center of the platform, his Draxan physiology commanding immediate attention. 7 feet of densely packed muscle covered in natural armor, plating that gleamed like polished obsidian. He embodied everything the warrior cultures of the galaxy aspired to be. His head, vaguely reptilian with a pronounced cranial crest, turned slowly as Naomi found her seat among the other cadets. Today, Gorvek's voice rumbled like tectonic plates grinding together. We analyzed the failed Corvin offensive of Stellar Cycle 14,203. Who can identify the primary tactical error that led to the decimation of the Third Fleet? Several appendages, tentacles, and manipulator limbs shot up around the room. Gorvek's predatory gaze swept over them before settling on a Threnodai cadet whose bioluminescent patches pulsed eagerly. Cadet Valon. The Threnodai's melodious voice filled the chamber. The fleet commanders failed to account for gravitational lensing effects when plotting their emergence vectors, sir. They materialized directly in the enemy's fire solution. Gorvek's jaw plates clicked, the Draxan equivalent of a dismissive grunt. Incorrect. Anyone else? More attempts followed, each meeting with the same rejection. Naomi had been reviewing the historical battle data for weeks, part of her personal campaign to over-prepare for every class. She knew the real answer, but raising her hand meant drawing attention, and attention in this environment rarely ended well for the lone human. Perhaps Gorvek's voice dripped with theatrical disappointment. Our newest edition has insights to share? Cadet Vance. Every photoreceptor, compound eye, and visual organ in the room swiveled toward her. Naomi stood, her voice steady despite the scrutiny. The primary tactical error wasn't technical, sir. It was cultural. The Corvin fleet commander was a Selthani, whose species communicates through bioelectric fields. When they interfaced with standard comms for multi-species coordination, critical positioning orders were mistranslated. What seemed like a flanking maneuver to the Selthani registered as a frontal assault to their Moravec allies. Silence stretched through the chamber like a hell breath. Gorvek's cranial crest flared slightly, a sign of agitation that Naomi had learned to recognize. You read subsection 47C of the classified after-action report, he stated flatly. Yes, sir. It was referenced in footnote 186 of the standard tactical manual. That subsection is above cadet clearance level. The footnote wasn't redacted, sir. The cross-reference was accessible through the Academy's historical archive interface. The clicking of Gorvek's jaw plates grew louder. Around the room, other cadets shifted uncomfortably. Challenging an instructor was rare. Correcting one was unheard of. Gorvek's species prided themselves on intellectual superiority almost as much as physical dominance. Being fact-checked by a human, barely evolved tree-dwellers, as he'd once described them in a lecture, was clearly rankling him. Very thorough, Cadet Vance. Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate similar attention to detail in practical application. His tone carried the unmistakable weight of a challenge. Sir, combat simulation. You'll run point on a squad-level engagement. Since you're so well-versed in avoiding tactical errors, this should be elementary. Naomi kept her expression neutral. Yes, sir. The next hour subjected her to one of the most grueling tactical scenarios in the Academy's database. Gorvek personally selected every variable, each one calibrated to highlight human physical limitations. Lower gravity that disadvantaged human muscle memory. Atmospheric conditions that stressed human respiratory systems. Enemy units specifically chosen for their speed and strength advantages. Naomi adapted. When the holofield spawned Krillian shock troops, insectoid warriors with reflexes 3 times faster than human baseline, she used terrain and timing instead of direct confrontation. When the simulation introduced Gorvani-heavy units, she exploited their turn radius limitations. Each challenge Gorvek threw at her, she met with careful strategy rather than brute force. The final score displayed across the holofield. Mission success, 87% efficiency rating. For any other cadet, it would have been exemplary. The best scores rarely exceeded 75%. But Gorvek's assessment was delivered with barely concealed disdain. Adequate. Barely. Your over-reliance on defensive positioning shows the typical human aversion to necessary risk. In real combat, such timidity costs lives. With respect, sir, Naomi remained at attention. The tactical manual emphasizes force preservation when outnumbered 3-1. The manual assumes competent warriors, not fragile humans playing at soldier. The insult landed like a slap, drawing scattered chuckles from some cadets. Your species' physical limitations make you a liability in any real combat scenario. Heat crept up Naomi's neck, but she kept her voice level. Historical analysis shows human units have maintained a 73% success rate in multi-species engagements since integration, sir. By cowering behind superior species and claiming credit for alliance victories. Gorvek's crest was now fully extended, his agitation plain. But perhaps you need more direct instruction. Combat platform. Now, the meaning was clear. Personal combat demonstration, instructor versus student. It was technically within regulations, but rarely invoked unless a cadet needed humbling. Naomi descended to the platform, acutely aware of every eye tracking her movement. Standard grappling rules, Gorvek announced, his bulk seeming to grow larger as Naomi approached. First to achieve submission or ring out. Cadet Vance will demonstrate human combat effectiveness. They squared off in the center of the platform. At 7 feet versus her 5'7" frame, Gorvek loomed like a monument to evolutionary warfare. His natural armor plating alone probably weighed more than Naomi's entire body. The smart money would have given her 30 seconds, maybe less. The engagement began with textbook circling. Naomi stayed light on her feet, watching for the telltale muscle bunching that preceded a Draxon charge. When it came, she was already moving, using his momentum to slide past rather than meet force with force. Gorvek wheeled with surprising agility, one massive arm sweeping toward her. Naomi dropped beneath it, rolled, and came up behind him. Her academy training kicked in. Joint locks were useless against Draxon physiology, strikes to armored areas pointless. She needed to frustrate him, make him overcommit. Evasion isn't combat. Human, Gorvek growled, pivoting to track her movement. Face me properly. Naomi maintained her defensive stance. Tactical withdrawal is a legitimate strategy, sir." The next exchange came faster. Gorvek's hand shot out with serpentine speed, catching Naomi's shoulder. She twisted with the grip rather than against it, using the point of contact as a pivot to shift her center of gravity. Her knee came up toward his midsection, not to damage, but to create space. That's when it happened. Instead of the expected counter-technique or regulation throw, Gorvek's free hand swept across in a sharp arc. The back of his armored hand connected with Naomi's face in a clear, deliberate slap. The impact sent her stumbling backward, her cheek instantly burning with the combined force and humiliation of the blow. The training hall fell into absolute silence. A slap wasn't a combat technique. It wasn't instruction. It was pure degradation, meant to humiliate rather than teach. Several cadets audibly gasped. Even those who'd laughed at Gorvek's earlier insults looked uncomfortable. There were lines, even in combat training, and he just crossed one. Naomi straightened slowly, her hand touching her reddening cheek. Years of diplomatic briefings, cultural sensitivity training, and careful human integration protocols flashed through her mind. She was supposed to be an ambassador for her species, a model of restraint, but she was also a soldier. And soldiers had protocols for unprovoked assault. Gorvek was already turning away, satisfied with his point made. His crest had settled, his body language radiating smug superiority. He put the upstart human in her place, shown the class what happened when lesser species forgot their position. He never saw Naomi move. Human muscle fiber might be less dense than Draxon. Human bones might lack natural armor plating. But humans had spent 3 million years evolving as persistence hunters, developing neural pathways for precision that most species achieved only through cybernetic enhancement. Naomi's counter wasn't flashy. It wasn't even particularly fast by galactic standards, but it was devastatingly precise. Her fingers struck like surgical instruments at the base of Gorvek's cranial crest, targeting a cluster of neural ganglia that controlled equilibrium and motor function in Draxon physiology. It was knowledge gained not from combat manuals, but from an obscure xenobiology text she'd studied in her quest to understand her classmates better. The effect was instantaneous. Gorvek's legs buckled as his nervous system hiccuped. His arms windmilled briefly, seeking balance that wouldn't come. Then all 7 feet and 400 pounds of Draxon superiority crashed to the platform with a resonant thud that echoed through the chamber. He tried to rise, muscles straining, but his motor control remained scrambled. Neural connections fired randomly, sending conflicting signals that left him sprawled and twitching on the combat mat. "Human limitations," Naomi said quietly, her voice carrying in the stunned silence, "force us to study, to learn, to understand every possible advantage." She stepped back, maintaining proper combat stance. That nerve cluster is mentioned exactly once in xenobiology literature, a vestigial weakness from before your species developed natural armor. The security system had already activated, medical drones descending toward the platform. Gorvek's jaw plates worked soundlessly, his eyes fixed on Naomi with an expression somewhere between rage and disbelief. Around the room, cadets representing dozens of species stared in shock. The human, the physically inferior, barely evolved human, had just dropped one of the Academy's most formidable combat instructors with a single precise strike. The summons to the Academy Director's office came within minutes. The office existed in its own dimensional pocket, accessible only through quantum-locked doorways that ensured absolute privacy. Director Zethwayan materialized as Naomi entered, or perhaps had always been there. As a non-corporeal entity from the Void Collective, their existence operated on principles that challenge conventional understanding of presence and absence. Lieutenant Colonel Gorvek has been restored to full function. Zethwayan's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He has filed a formal complaint. Assault on a superior officer. Conduct unbecoming. Use of restricted combat techniques. Naomi stood at attention, her cheek still bearing the mark of Gorvek's strike. "I acted in self-defense, Director." The colonel maintains it was a standard combat demonstration that you escalated beyond acceptable parameters. The security footage will show he struck me with a non-regulation blow intended to humiliate rather than instruct. Zethwayan's presence shifted, and suddenly the entire sequence replayed in the air between them. A perfect holographic recreation drawn from the Academy's quantum surveillance network. The slap played out in excruciating detail, followed by Naomi's precise retaliation. The strike was inappropriate, Zethwayan acknowledged. However, your response utilized knowledge from restricted xenobiology texts. The text wasn't restricted, Director. It was in the public archive. Cross-reference from a footnote in Advanced Xenological Studies, Volume 7. You maintain this was self-defense. I maintain it was a measured response to unprovoked assault. The technique I used is reversible and causes no permanent damage. It's actually less harmful than many approved training strikes. The silence stretched as Zethwayan processed this. Non-corporeal beings experience time differently, and Naomi had learned to wait patiently during these pauses. Finally, the director's attention refocused. Lieutenant Colonel Gorvek's actions violated 17 separate Academy protocols regarding instructor conduct. Your response, while technically excessive, fell within acceptable parameters for self-defense against superior officers. Naomi remained silent, sensing more was coming. However, Zethwayan continued, this incident reflects a deeper issue. The Academy cannot tolerate instructors who allow personal bias to influence their teaching methods, nor can we ignore cadets who demonstrate exceptional capability to acquire and utilize sensitive information. The air shimmered, and Gorvek materialized in the office, his posture rigid with barely contained fury. His crest flared the moment he saw Naomi. Director, this human violated no regulations that you yourself had not already broken, Zethwayan interrupted. The footage is unambiguous. You struck a cadet with intent to humiliate. She responded with proportional force, using publicly available knowledge. Gorvek's jaw plates ground together. She should never have been admitted to advanced training. Humans lack the physical capability. Yet she neutralized you with a single strike. Perhaps physical capability is not the only measure of military effectiveness. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Gorvek's crest slowly lowered, the fight beginning to drain from his posture. Your new assignment, Zethwayan announced, is to the Multi-Species Integration Program. You will co-instruct with Cadet Vance on cross-cultural combat adaptation. This will require you to attend sensitivity training and collaborative teaching workshops. Cadet Vance. Gorvek's voice cracked with disbelief. She's a student who demonstrated superior tactical knowledge and practical application. Her insights into species-specific vulnerabilities will be invaluable to the program. Zethwayan's attention shifted to Naomi. You will maintain your cadet status while serving as auxiliary instructor. This is not a punishment for either of you. It's an opportunity to transform conflict into progress. Naomi felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving humanity's place in the galactic community. I accept, Director. Gorvek's resistance lasted another long moment before his shoulders sagged slightly. As do I. Excellent. Classes begin next cycle. I suggest you both use the intervening time to prepare curriculum that emphasizes intellectual adaptation over physical superiority. Dismissed. The weeks that followed reshaped the Academy in subtle but significant ways. The story of the human cadet who dropped a Draxan combat instructor spread through informal networks, gaining embellishments with each retelling. Some versions had Naomi wielding ancient human martial arts. Others credited her with psychic abilities. The truth, that she'd simply studied harder than anyone expected, was somehow more disturbing to those who clung to traditional hierarchies. The first multi-species integration class drew standing room-only attendance. Cadets who'd never shown interest in tactical theory suddenly found reasons to audit the course. Gorvek entered the classroom with the careful dignity of someone determined to salvage his reputation. Naomi followed, her cadet insignia now supplemented with the auxiliary instructor badge. Combat effectiveness. Gorvek began, his voice notably lacking its usual disdain, cannot be measured by physical attributes alone. Today's demonstration will illustrate this principle. He gestured to Naomi, who stepped forward with a holographic projector. The air filled with anatomical diagrams of 24 different species, each annotated with vulnerability indices and adaptation strategies. Every species, Naomi explained, evolves with inherent advantages and weaknesses. Traditional combat doctrine focuses on maximizing advantages. But true tactical superiority comes from understanding and exploiting the weaknesses everyone assumes don't exist. The first volunteer was a Krillian cadet whose species prided themselves on their impenetrable exoskeletons. Within minutes, Naomi had demonstrated 3 non-force-based techniques that could incapacitate a Krillian warrior, all derived from studying their molting cycles and joint articulation patterns. Gorvek watched with an expression that might have been respect. When it came time for his portion of the instruction, he admitted something that shocked the class. I believed physical superiority determined combat effectiveness. Cadet Vance proved otherwise. Strength without understanding is just potential energy without direction. The classes continued, each session breaking down more barriers. Cadets who dismissed humans as weak began studying human adaptability. Instructors who'd focused solely on physical training incorporated intellectual preparation. The Academy's culture shifted slowly but perceptibly. The final session of the term brought an unexpected moment. As cadets filed out, Gorvek approached Naomi with careful deliberation. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words clearly difficult. "Not just for the slap, for the disrespect, for the bias." Naomi met his gaze. "We all carry biases, sir. The difference is whether we let them define us or choose to grow beyond them." Gorvek's crest dipped, a gesture of acknowledgement among his people. "You would have made an exceptional Draxon. And you," Naomi smiled slightly, "are becoming an exceptional teacher." The moment stretched between them, 2 beings from different worlds finding common ground in the vast expanse of space. Outside the windows, Varlon 7 continued its eternal dance, its storms swirling in patterns that had existed long before either of their species achieved sentience. Months later, when the annual Academy evaluations were published, the multi-species integration program received the highest effectiveness rating of any combat course. The review board particularly noted the unprecedented collaboration between species previously considered incompatible in training scenarios. Naomi stood in the same observation corridor where she'd begun her journey, watching new cadets navigate the halls. Among them, she spotted the first group from the integration program, Krillians training alongside Threnodidae, Draxon collaborating with humans. The rigid hierarchies hadn't disappeared, but they'd become more fluid, more open to merit over birthright. Second thoughts? Gorvek's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him in his new uniform, the insignia of the integration program prominent on his chest. "About the path you set us on. Change isn't always comfortable. Neither is stagnation," Naomi replied. "Besides, discomfort is how we grow." Gorvek's jaw plates clicked, and what she'd learned was amusement. Spoken like a true instructor. He paused, then added, "The next class includes 3 more humans. They all cite you as their inspiration for applying." Naomi felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. "And they'll find fair treatment. They'll find challenges. Real ones. Based on capability, not prejudice." His crest shifted in what might have been pride. "It's the least we can offer those willing to reach beyond their limitations." They stood together in comfortable silence, teacher and student, former adversaries now allies, watching the future of the galaxy take shape in the corridors below. The storms of Varlon 7 continued their ancient patterns, but here, in this small corner of the universe, new patterns were emerging. In her final evaluation that term, Naomi wrote, "The greatest weakness in combat is not physical limitation, but intellectual rigidity." The greatest strength is not superior biology, but superior adaptability. When we stop seeing differences as hierarchies and start seeing them as opportunities, we transform conflict into evolution. The words became required reading for all incoming cadets, regardless of species. And though she never sought credit, Naomi knew that every time a cadet looked beyond physical appearance to find strategic advantage, every time an instructor chose understanding over assumption, the galaxy became a little more united. The slap that had meant to humble her had instead catalyzed change. Not through violence or revenge, but through the patient work of turning enemies into teachers, prejudice into progress, and isolation into integration. As she prepared for her final cadet evaluation, Naomi received an unexpected message. The Galactic Military Council had reviewed the Academy's new programs and wanted to implement similar initiatives throughout their training facilities. They requested that Lieutenant Cadet Vance and Lieutenant Colonel Gorvek serve as the primary advisory team. Gorvek found her in the tactical library, surrounded by star charts and training manuals. A human and a Draxan redesigning military education, he mused. The council must be either very wise or very desperate. Maybe both, Naomi suggested, closing her datapad. Real change usually requires a bit of each. Your species has a saying about teaching old dogs new tricks. We do, but we have another saying, it's never too late to learn. Gorvek's crest rippled with what she now knew was genuine pleasure. Then let us prove both sayings wrong. Or right, depending on perspective. As they began planning their presentation for the council, Naomi reflected on how far they'd both come. The slap had been a moment of humiliation that became a catalyst for transformation. The retaliation that could have ended her career had instead launched a new chapter for both of them. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest hits were the ones that taught the greatest lessons. And sometimes, the best response to force wasn't more force. It was the patient strength to transform conflict into collaboration. The stars visible through the library's viewport seemed to pulse with possibility. Humanity had spent millennia looking up at those stars, dreaming of taking their place among them. Now, as Naomi worked alongside a former adversary to reshape the future of galactic military culture, she understood that earning that place required more than just reaching the stars. It required changing them. The final ceremony of the academic cycle brought together cadets, instructors, and dignitaries from across the galaxy. Naomi stood at attention as Director Zithwian's presence filled the ceremonial chamber. Lieutenant Cadet Naomi Vance, the director intoned, for exceptional service to the ideals of the Interstellar Military Academy, for transforming challenge into opportunity, and for demonstrating that strength comes in many forms. You are hereby granted early advancement to full lieutenant, with commendation. The appointment was unprecedented for a human, but the applause that followed was genuine. Even the Draxan contingent, led by Gorvek, acknowledged the achievement with their traditional salute. Later, as the ceremony wound down, Naomi found herself back in the observation corridor, the same spot where she'd stood months ago, uncertain and isolated. Now, cadets from a dozen species nodded respectfully as they passed. Some even paused to discuss tactical theories or ask advice about the integration program. You know, Gorvek joined her at the window. I never did master that nerve strike technique. The beauty of it, Naomi smiled, is that you'll never need to. We've moved beyond that kind of solution. Indeed, he paused, then added with uncharacteristic vulnerability, though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't lost my temper that day. If I just continued the lesson normally, then we'd both still be trapped in our assumptions. You believing humans were weak. Me believing I had to hide my knowledge to fit in. She turned to face him fully. That slap was the best thing that ever happened to both of us. Gorvek's crest rippled with complex emotions. A painful lesson delivered poorly, but learned well. The best ones usually are. As they watched the eternal storms of Varlon, seven swirl below them, Naomi thought about the report she would soon deliver to the Galactic Council. How do you quantify the value of change minds? How do you measure the strategic importance of mutual respect? You don't, she decided. You simply demonstrate it one interaction at a time, until the new way becomes the only way anyone can imagine. Your weakness, she said quietly, echoing words from their first confrontation, isn't your biology. It's assuming others don't know yours. And our strength, Gorvek completed the thought, isn't in our armor or our weapons. It's in our willingness to admit when we're wrong. The Academy's lights dimmed as the cycle shifted to night rotation. Around them, the station hummed with the life of 1,000 different species, all learning to work together in the vast tapestry of galactic civilization. It wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still prejudices, still moments of friction. But there was also progress. Slow, sometimes painful, often challenging progress. As Naomi turned to leave, ready to begin her new role as full lieutenant and integration specialist, she paused at the corridor's entrance. "Thank you," she said simply. Gorvek understood. "No, thank you for showing me that the greatest victory isn't in defeating an enemy. It's in turning them into an ally." The night cycle settled over the Academy as two officers, Human and Draxon, former adversaries, now colleagues, went their separate ways to prepare for the next day's challenges. Behind them, Varlon, 7 continued its eternal rotation, indifferent to the small dramas playing out in the station above. But in the grand schema of galactic history, small dramas sometimes sparked great changes. A single slap, delivered in anger and returned with wisdom, had set in motion reforms that would reshape military culture across known space. Somewhere in the archives, historians would record it as the Integration Initiative of 14,827. But those who lived through it would remember it differently, as the day a human cadet proved that strength wasn't about the size of your fists, but the size of your understanding. And in the vast, swirling cosmos, understanding was the most powerful force of all. The story of Naomi Vance became required study at military academies throughout the galaxy, but she herself remained focused on the work ahead. Each new class of cadets brought fresh challenges, new biases to overcome, different perspectives to integrate. The incident with Gorvek was never far from her mind, not as a moment of triumph, but as a reminder that every conflict held the seeds of potential collaboration. Years later, when asked about that pivotal moment by a documentary crew, Naomi's response was characteristic. "Violence is easy. Understanding is hard. But only one of them builds a future worth living in." The documentary included footage of the current academy, where humans and Draxon trained side by side, where physical disparities were seen as puzzles to solve rather than hierarchies to enforce. Gorvek, now promoted to full colonel and head of the integration program, added his own perspective. "I learned that day that being strong doesn't mean being inflexible. True strength adapts. It learns. It grows. Cadet Vance didn't defeat me with her strike. She defeated the limitations I'd placed on my own thinking." The ripple effects continued for decades. Military tactics evolved to emphasize cognitive adaptation. Academy curricula expanded to include mandatory xenobiology and cultural studies. The rigid caste systems that had defined galactic military structure gradually gave way to merit-based advancement. Not everyone embraced the changes. There were holdouts, traditionalists who saw the integration movement as a weakening of military standards. But results spoke louder than rhetoric. Multi-species units consistently outperformed homogeneous ones. Tactical flexibility trumped brute force in engagement after engagement. On the 20th anniversary of what cadets had come to call the slap heard round the galaxy, a commemoration ceremony brought together veterans of that transformative period. Naomi, now bearing the rank of admiral, stood beside General Gorvek as they unveiled a monument in the Academy's central plaza. The sculpture depicted 2 hands, one human, one Draxon, not locked in combat but extended in greeting. The inscription below read, "From conflict to collaboration, in memory of all who chose understanding over assumption." "You know," Gorvek remarked as they studied their younger selves captured in bronze and titanium, "I never did apologize for that slap properly." "You did," Naomi corrected. Every day you chose to grow instead of staying bitter. Every cadet you taught to see beyond surface differences. Every reform you championed. That's the only apology that mattered. The ceremony concluded with a demonstration by current cadets, a mixed unit executing maneuvers that would have been impossible under the old system. Humans provided tactical analysis, Krillians handled heavy assault, Threnodidae managed communications, and Draxan coordinated ground operations. Each species contributing their strengths, compensating for others' weaknesses. As the crowd dispersed, a young human cadet approached nervously. "Admiral Vance? I'm Cadet Sarah Chun. I just wanted to say thank you for making it possible for us to be here." Naomi smiled. "I didn't make it possible. I just refused to accept that it was impossible. There's a difference." Still, the cadet persisted. "You changed everything." "No," Gorvek interjected gently. "We changed everything. Together. That's the real lesson." The cadet saluted and departed, rejoining her multi-species squad. Watching them go, Naomi felt the satisfaction of work well done. The galaxy still faced challenges, border conflicts, resource disputes, the eternal friction of different cultures sharing finite space. But now they faced them with tools beyond weapons and armor. "Any regrets?" Gorvek asked. "Only one," Naomi admitted, "that it took a moment of violence to catalyze so much positive change. I sometimes wonder if there was another way. Perhaps. But we can't change the past. We can only ensure its lessons shape a better future." They stood in companionable silence as the artificial sunset painted the Academy spires in shades of gold and crimson. The same view Naomi had contemplated as a nervous cadet, uncertain of her place in the vast galactic order. Now, that uncertainty had transformed into purpose. The next morning brought new challenges, as mornings always did. A border dispute requiring careful negotiation. A new species applying for Academy admission. Fresh cadets arriving with their own prejudices and preconceptions, ready to have their worldviews expanded. Naomi and Gorvek met them all with the same patient determination that had carried them through 2 decades of transformation. Each challenge was an opportunity. Each conflict, a chance for growth. Each moment of friction, a possibility for creating something stronger through synthesis. The slap still echoed through history, but its meaning had evolved. What began as an act of dominance had become a symbol of transformation. What started as humiliation had grown into mutual respect. What could have ended careers had instead launched a movement that reshaped galactic civilization. In her private quarters that evening, Naomi reviewed the day's reports. Graduation rates up across all species. Integration scores at historic highs. New tactical innovations emerging from multi-species think tanks. The metrics told a story of success, but she knew the real victory lay in less quantifiable changes. Somewhere in the galaxy, a Draxan warrior was learning patience from a human philosopher. A human engineer was studying Krillian exoskeleton design. A Threnodidae artist was teaching Gorvani soldiers the tactical applications of bioluminescent communication. Barriers fell daily, not through force but through understanding. Her comm unit chimed. A message from Gorvek, coffee. Tomorrow before briefing, found an interesting text on human strategic thinking. Would value your perspective. Naomi smiled and confirmed. After 20 years, they still challenged each other, still pushed for better understanding, still refused to let comfort breed complacency. It was, she reflected, exactly what education should be, a lifelong commitment to growth. The stars outside her window held the same allure they'd always had for humanity. But now, humans weren't just reaching for them. They were helping to reshape the civilizations that dwelt among them, not through conquest or coercion, but through the patient work of building bridges across the vast gulfs of biological and cultural difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cadets who needed to learn that strength came in many forms, new conflicts that required wisdom over force, new opportunities to prove that diversity was not a weakness to be tolerated, but a strength to be celebrated. But tonight, as Varlon 7 turned its face toward the distant stars, Admiral Naomi Vance, who had once been just another underestimated human cadet, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Not for the rank she'd achieved or the accolades she'd earned, but for the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, beings who might have been enemies were becoming allies. All because she'd refused to accept that a slap was the end of a story rather than the beginning of a better one. The communicator chimed again. This time, a priority message from the Galactic Council. A new species had made contact, silicon-based beings from the Magellanic Clouds. They were requesting diplomatic protocols and military liaison. The Council wanted the integration team to handle first contact. Naomi read the details with growing interest. A completely different biological framework. Communication through crystalline resonance. Military traditions based on geological timescales. It would challenge every assumption, require entirely new approaches. Perfect. She sent a message to Gorvek. New assignment. Bigger challenge than anything we've faced. Interested. The response came immediately. Already packing. When do we leave? Something's never changed. And in a universe of infinite diversity, perhaps the most constant truth was this. Every challenge was an opportunity. Every difference a chance to grow. Every moment of conflict a possibility for transformation. The slap had taught them that. Now, they would teach others. As she began preparing for the mission, Naomi thought about that young cadet she'd been, standing in the academy corridor, worried about living up to expectations. She'd like to tell that younger self not to worry. That the very things that seemed like weaknesses, humanity's lack of natural armor, their physical limitations, their need to study and understand rather than rely on inherited advantages, would become their greatest contributions to galactic culture. But perhaps it was better that she hadn't known. Perhaps the uncertainty, the need to prove herself, the willingness to stand up even when outnumbered and outmatched, perhaps those are the real gifts humanity brought to the stars. The integration movement had begun with a slap and a counterstrike, but it had grown through patience, understanding, and the radical idea that difference need not mean division. 20 years later, the galaxy was stronger for it. And as Admiral Naomi Vance began planning for first contact with beings of living crystal, she knew the work was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. Each new species, each fresh perspective, each moment of friction followed by understanding. They all added threads to the tapestry of galactic civilization. The slap still echoed, but now it echoed with possibility. Outside, the stars beckoned with their ancient light, each one a sun-warming worlds full of potential allies, trading partners, fellow travelers in the cosmic journey. Humanity had earned its place among them not through force, but through the willingness to learn, adapt, and transform conflict into collaboration. It was, Naomi reflected as she closed her files for the night, exactly what the galaxy had needed. Not another warrior species, but a catalyst for change. Not conquerors, but connectors. Not the strongest, but perhaps the most adaptable. And in a universe of infinite diversity and challenge, adaptability was the ultimate survival trait. The future stretched ahead, full of unknown challenges and unprecedented opportunities. But whatever it held, Naomi knew that the lessons learned in that training hall 20 years ago would continue to guide them. Strength through understanding. Power through cooperation. Victory through transformation. The slap had been meant to put humanity in its place. Instead, it had helped humanity find its purpose. And that purpose, building bridges across the vast divisions of species and culture, would shape the galaxy for generations to come.